Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Barry Merrick. I'm co-founder and CEO at Ivy and the chapter chair of YPO Metro New York. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce all of you to MV Lee Badgett. Lee, welcome. How are you today?
I'm doing quite well. We have a lovely fall day up here in New England.
Well, so glad that you could join us on this beautiful day. I'm incredibly excited for our conversation. And to remind everybody of the context of why we've gathered here today, we're going to be discussing how we can all better leverage the power of fair and equal treatment. And Lee is a truly ideal guide for this conversation. She's a professor of economics and co-director of the Center for Employment Equity at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And she's also the former director of the School of Public Policy. She's, in addition to that, Williams Distinguished Scholar at UCLA's Williams Institute, where she was both the co-founder and the first research director. Her research focuses on economic inequality for LGBT people, including wage gaps, employment discrimination and poverty, and the global cost of homophobia and transphobia. In 2008, Curve magazine named her one of the 20 most powerful lesbians in academia, and she has appeared on the Advocate magazine's Our Best and Brightest Activist list. So thank you, Lee, for joining us. And to help us kind of get started on this incredibly important topic today, in your latest book, by its very title, you say that fair and equal treatment benefits us all, and you say this as an economist. Could you please share with us why this is the case and why it's so important for all of the organization leaders joining us today to engage deeply with this topic?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. I think, we often start on issues like this related to human rights frameworks, right? So we think, what's the right thing to do? What's the right way to treat people? And I think that's a great way to think about these issues. Even economists believe in human rights, but we also know that treating people fairly means that they have a greater ability to contribute to society, to contribute to economies in particular, and that's everywhere from their communities, their businesses, the businesses they work in, or organizations they work in, all the way up to the kind of larger globe macro economy. So the question that I kind of look at basically is, how do we think about that? How do we actually trace the kind of treatment that LGBT people face and see how it holds them back from economic participation?
Excellent. And just at a very high level, what's the cost of what is the cost of not getting this right? And what are the key benefits from an economic perspective of getting inclusion right from what you've seen?
Yeah, from a very high level, like looking across a whole economy, for example, we know from several studies that I've done and that other people have done that it could be as much as 1% of GDP. And that, in a COVID era recession, that doesn't sound very bad, but it's really like putting ourselves in a permanent recession. So that's sort of one way to think about it. We also know that comparing countries that have different ways of different levels of dealing with LGBT people in terms of their inclusion, that the ones who do a better job, who are more formally inclusive, they actually are doing better in terms of higher GDP. So we've seen that actually in lots of different studies. So at a very high level, it's very clear that there's a very clear connection between inclusion of LGBT people and a successful economy. So that's kind of like the highest level. You could see that in businesses as well, kind of looking at organizations that are, for-profit companies that are probably not approaching this issue from a human rights perspective. They're approaching it from a business perspective. And what they say is, when they add policies that treat LGBT people more inclusively in their workplaces, they say we're doing this because it's the right thing, but mainly because it's the right business decision. And that is confirmed by lots of research that shows that companies that are more inclusive have higher stock prices, higher profit levels, and in some cases, more creative people, we've seen in some studies.
Got it. Thank you. And why is that? So what are the kind of key drivers of creating extra economic value, for example, from getting this right? and what causes for value to not be created or be destroyed when companies don't do this right.
Yeah, that's where it's helpful to dig down into the individual level. In the book, I tell some stories about people who really show what difference that makes. So there was a young man named Pema Dorji from Bhutan whose description of his education, I think, is really really captures what's at stake here. The way he put it was, going to school was like going to war. So he was putting himself on the front lines. He and was bullied by his classmates, sometimes by his teachers even. The teachers were certainly no help. And it took its toll. It made him depressed and sort of held back his ability to take in as much from his schooling as he probably would have otherwise. And we see that in the larger statistics as well. Actually, bullying is very common in schools all over the world. So, and it's not just related to being LGBT, but it has real harms to people. But LGBT young people tend to face more of it. So again, around the world, UNESCO, which is the UN agency that looks at studies education, they found reports from 94 different countries that documented just how deep those challenges are for LGBT young people, and it has effects on their educational outcomes. So they have lower grade point averages. They might drop out of school more. They're less likely to continue on in school. So those individuals are really not able to get the kind of education that they're capable of, and the kind of education that we want them to have in order to contribute to their economies. Economists know that education, we call it human capital, that education is a really important thing for the success and the growth of economies. Actually, one thing that I found particularly interesting was some research that shows that it's not just even the people who are bullied who face those kinds of challenges. Schools that have more bullying overall, actually all students are less successful in terms of learning. So they have lower test scores, for example, where they have lots of bullying. So at that most basic level, starting early on in life, LGBT young people are being held back. It's kind of you could think of it as a headwind, or weights on their legs or something like that. But they're just not going to get the amount and the kind of education that we want them to get. So you see that right from the start.
Got it. Thank you, Lee. And so I would love for you to share with us clearly, that beginning of the journey being disadvantaged obviously has ramifications once they also join the workforce. Could you share with us when you look at from an employer's perspective, what do you see as the biggest myths, mistakes, or misunderstandings when it comes to this particular topic of LGBT inclusion, but also LGBT inclusion as a case study also for inclusion more broadly?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly when LGBT people get to work, they're going to face very similar kinds of challenges. And I think that that sometimes employers forget that although, things have gotten better in many ways. I mean, culturally, there's much more acceptance of LGBT people. We have better policies. We have marriage equality. That's a big thing. And I think sometimes there's an assumption that we've sort of left all the bad stuff behind. But in fact, there still are people who hold biases, sometimes the ones that they're not aware of. We learned a lot about this regarding race and sexual orientation and gender identity and gender, that people have these stereotypes that matter for how they act regarding other people, and they're just not always even aware of them. So you can think, oh, I'm not racist, or I'm not homophobic, but in fact, sometimes very deeply we're raised in these cultures that sort of embed these biases very deeply. So I think the first thing is that it's still a problem. Discrimination still exists. Thousands of people a year file charges with Fair Employment Practices agencies or with our EEOC at the national level. Surveys continue to show that people are experiencing discrimination, what they see as discrimination. And we actually even have a way of kind of capturing, what happens if people were more open. Actually, I think there's an idea that our workplaces have become so gay friendly that everything is great. But in fact, still only about half of LGBT people are open about their sexual orientation or their gender identity to their coworkers, so to most or all of their coworkers. So there's still a lot of people who don't feel like it's safe. And that's not good for them. We know that being closeted is bad for people's health. And it's not good for employers, because we know that it's harder for people to develop meaningful relationships with the folks that they work with. I mean, we work a lot in teams these days. It's, even college professors, who kind of sit and write things by themselves. I mean, most of the day we're actually talking to other people. So relationships matter, and they're not going to be as authentic when people can't be who they are and be open about that. So I think there still are those misperceptions that we've left all that behind, but it's still there.
Got it. Thank you so much. So given that these issues are still out there, but also given the progress that may have been made by certain companies and so on, based on your research, what would you say are, at the highest level, what are the key ingredients when it comes to doing LGBT inclusion right and doing inclusion right in general? If you could give us like a bird's eye view of like what the key things that seem to work best are, and then we can take them in turn and explore how we can best implement them in our organizations, but also as individuals and as nations as well.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a temptation to see it as a checklist kind of exercise. So there are some benchmarking surveys that get done in different parts of the world. In the US, the one that's kind of the one that's been around the longest and is the most fully developed globally, I would say, is the Human Rights Campaign's Corporate Equality Index. And they have a very clear set of policies that they're looking for, and actually they keep moving the bar because they know that the companies are evolving, right? So it used to just be you had to have sexual orientation, non-discrimination policies, and domestic partner benefits, but then kind of transgender people's experiences became more important in that context. So now gender affirming healthcare benefits and non-discrimination policies that include gender identity are very common. And actually, it's interesting because the benchmarking itself sort of led a lot of companies to say, hey, okay, we need to do that next. But then there's sort of deeper kinds of engagements that companies are having with their LGBT employees. Do they have an employee resource group that exists to provide support to themselves, but also a conduit to talk to human resources or the CEO or whomever they feel like they need to talk to kind of make their experiences and their needs known. There are policies related to, kinds of diversity training or explaining to people what the policies are, making sure everybody's on the same page in the company, making sure that supply chains are also acting in non-discriminatory ways, companies in the supply chain, and that there's a growing I think a growing awareness that really inclusion reaches every kind of decision that companies make. So everything from making donations to organizations, to political donations, to speaking out on issues of concern, those are all there kind of pushing out on the frontier. The other frontier is global. So it's easy to do a lot of these things in the United States, but can you do them in Taiwan? Can you do them in Singapore? Can you do them in India or in Africa? So that's where companies are, I think, really the ones that have come the farthest in terms of looking at this in the United States are now kind of thinking about that more globally. But I think, it's a great checklist, and I encourage companies and employers to take a look at that. But it is just a checklist. I actually had an experience of I was invited to by the U.S. State Department to go to Peru and talk about some of these same issues in different kinds of contexts. And as part of it, the U.S. Embassy in Lima is a big employer, and they said, "Oh, we would like to talk to you about these issues, about making sure that we are doing what we can." And as we sat down, we kind of went through the checklist. They had done all those things, and they're like, "Well, what else? What else do we need to do?" And finally, I said, "Well, what do your LGBTQ employees tell you about this?" Silence. They hadn't ever actually talked to them because they said that they didn't know any, because the U.S. employees in the embassy were, some of them were very openly LGBT, but the Peruvians who were working there were not. So I think being proactive means kind of understanding that if you're not hearing from the people that you think you're creating policies for, then you're missing something. The employee resource groups serve that purpose in many places, but if it's not there, then there are other things that companies are going to have to do to reach out.
Excellent, thank you. So in short, what you're sharing here is that like there are these checklists out there that like creating an employee resource group, creating the conduits for communication, making sure that this is not just with employees, but across supply chains and hiring decisions, everything that people, leaders in a company, all the decisions that they're making. I just want to ask you, I mean, if you, having researched everything that you have done, if you were to be given a position at the helm of a company to like, enhance their policies when it came to inclusion, what are the most immediate things you would do? Obviously, every company is at different levels, but as much as, checklists are not ideal, like what would be your game plan? And I ask that so that we can all reflect on our own organizations and think through this in the same way.
Yeah. Well, you could, take the girl out of economics, but you can't take her out of data. So I would look at the data, right? So I think that's one key issue that it can be a really helpful resource for employers. Employers who are federal contractors, for example, are used to having to think hard about their workforces and how well they match the existing labor supply. But every employer really needs to be doing that. And the problem is that in the U.S. Our government makes only big companies kind of track those things and only looks at race and gender. But there are many other different kinds of experiences that people are going to have, people with disabilities, LGBT people. There are ways to also collect data there too. And that's also part of the frontier, I think, for a lot of companies. Many more are now asking or are now providing opportunities, I guess I should put it, for LGBT employees to self-identify. And that gives the company, a sense of whether or not they're doing a good job. I think for LGBT people, whether or not they're doing a good job for creating an environment where people feel open enough to say back to the employer that they are LGBT. But if you put questions on workforce engagement surveys or other kinds of tools that companies commonly use, this is what I would do, to make sure that we can use that data to identify places where we're doing a good job and places where we need to do better. And so sometimes it's about representation, but sometimes it's about the experience. So you're only going to know that if you go out and ask people, I think. And so that's where I would go.
Okay, so just let's zone in a little bit more on that. So we're gathering data either in a special survey or we're incorporating it into the surveys that we have. And one question is to encourage people to self-identify, but what else do you ask them to figure out, are they having challenges, and also how do you encourage them to share what could be better? And is it also fair to just expect them to find the solutions versus the employer being proactive
Mm-hmm.
in formulating those. So how would you go about it, like gathering the data, but then also acting on it too?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, yeah, that raises good questions. I mean, you can create surveys where you can actually see what kinds of concerns that people are having, whether or not they're hearing, homophobic or racist comments or sexist comments, whether or not they are experiencing, some kind of sexual harassment or other harassment that they're not reporting, because we do know that people often don't report things. And all of those from an employer perspective, I mean, those are big problems waiting to explode, right? So tapping into it beforehand to be able to identify maybe particular locations where that's an issue or something like that is one way to assess that, and to give feedback to to the people who are managing those locations, so that they can go out and try to find out what's going on. I think the other way that companies, I think, can learn is really by looking at each other. I mean, that's the advantage of the benchmarking surveys, but it's interesting. I mean, the companies who've been leaders in this area, in these areas of diversity, I think are always kind of pushing out, with the Black Lives Matter movement, kind of really raising the profile of issues of racism and employment. There are many companies that are kind of looking at that from all of the same kinds of perspectives. Everything from what's happening in the workforce, what does our pipeline look like to get people into our company? What else do we need to be doing as a responsible as a business who wants to create a better world? It's interesting because I feel like it's actually created this moment of idealism in a lot of companies. I mean, I've been reading about and sort of talking with people from some different companies that have really kind of pushed out on this issue. I mean, Cisco, for example, has like a whole page, a web page with lots of that keeps unfolding with all the many different things that they are planning to do. IBM is another great example of a company that's been really out there on the front lines on LGBT issues, and they keep looking. Where is it that they can go next? So, for example, one of the places they've gone next is thinking about the globalization of their policies, but also thinking about what it means to employees internally when the company speaks out on their behalf on important policy issues. So if there's an anti-gay bill that's being floated in places, which it was in places like North Carolina or Texas, they have taken kind of a proactive responsibility to go in and lobby against that, and to bring their employees in with them to be part of that process. So they're, these are learning organizations, right? They're kind of always looking for the next thing that they can do. They're not kind of stepping back and relying on the checklist sort of approach.
Got it. Thank you so much, Lee. So for all the organizations that are making progress on this, or the organizational leaders that are engaging in this conversation, thinking, okay, but we've actually we've done a lot of great things. We're very proud of like what we've achieved. One chapter in your book is dedicated to the strategies for realizing the gains from LGBT equality. So could you share with us, how you approach that question of how to really build on the momentum that a company is able to create?
Yeah. Definitely from the company's perspective, there are lots of opportunities that we've just talked about, but I think there are other ways that companies can also get involved. I took a more global perspective, and a more, I would say, social movement sort of perspective in that chapter. One thing that I think, this may sound kind of weird for an economist to say this, is the invisible hand is not always so powerful. That basically these changes have happened not because companies have said, oh, I think maybe I can improve my bottom line by being more inclusive. They've really happened because of the pressure and the education process of LGBT social movement organizations or these employee resource groups. the problem is that in other parts of the world, they're not very well funded. I mean, in the United States, there are groups that have very large budgets, very large staffs, and that has been essential for making a lot of progress. Sorry, my dog is relocating.
Good.
Anyway, so they've been very important for making those changes. But if we're going to think about what's happening globally, especially for companies that want to be more proactive globally, um, thinking about how to make those LGBT groups more powerful, I think is an important strategy, because um, that will make it possible for employees in other places to be more active in terms of talking with their employers. So there are lots of ways that companies can be involved in this. I mean, I think one is to be involved in global efforts to strengthen human rights for LGBT people. So, for example, the Global Equality Fund, which is a U.S. State Department initiative that's been around for a while, they've sort of harness the interests of governments in other parts of the world, funding from the US government, and they would really like to have lots more private sector partners in that effort to create grant programs that will strengthen organizations. There have not been very many corporate participants in that process. So getting people involved at that level, I think, is very important. Corporations could be much more, businesses could be much more involved in thinking about public policies. And it's interesting, I think for a business in another country that's trying to be culturally sensitive, it's sometimes hard to know how to approach LGBT issues. And so one strategy that I've seen at play in several different organizations is to get coalitions of companies who can together make a business case to policymakers in those countries to help support the human rights efforts of LGBT people. So groups like Open for Business or Out and Equal, the Human Rights Campaign as a global effort. There are lots of these different groups that are trying to pull together that kind of corporate power. So getting involved in those efforts, I think, is also a really great way for people to for companies to get involved.
Excellent. Thank you, Lee. So if we were to kind of just zoom out a little bit and share with us, over the last couple of decades, but really the most recent few years, what have been the key trends that you've been seeing at every level, globally, nationally, company-wide, individually? What have been the key trends? How have they been impacted by COVID, accelerated and decelerated when it comes to this particular topic of inclusion? And where do you see things going? And the reason I ask you this is just to see what do we have to celebrate about the progress that has been made and the LGBT inclusion front that could be applied to other inclusion related kind of causes out there. And then what are the ongoing shortcomings that we can learn from and do better at as we kind of do our best to shape the future?
Well, I think the changes within companies are one of the success stories. And you could actually even look at kind of the global push for marriage equality, for example, as something that was really in a lot of ways begun by companies. Companies were among the first sort of big institutions that recognize same-sex couples through domestic partner benefits. And that process has led companies to, kind of being involved in those debates in many different countries and supporting, efforts to get marriage equality in Taiwan and Ireland and Australia, not to mention the US. So that those very strong trends for companies, if you go back to the 1990s and just kind of look at the progress of non-discrimination policies and domestic partner benefits as an exponential curve, really big, sudden, steep increase in the number of companies offering that. So that's been big. If we think about it from the policy perspective, it's a mixed bag, actually, because while there are many countries that have started to add protections for the rights of LGBT people in employment, for example, or decriminalizing homosexuality. The trend overall is positive, but that disguises the fact that in some places there's been regression. And in many ways, some of the research shows that the most tolerant most tolerant countries have gotten more tolerant, and the least have gotten less tolerant. So there's definitely some polarization in terms of those policies. But even in those places, there's still groups that are pushing back. I think the COVID question has been huge, and I don't think we fully understand what the fallout is going to be on LGBT issues. In the United States, we can see on the data just how devastating the epidemic has been for African Americans and for Latinos, who have very high disproportionate rates of deaths and infections. There are some states that are supposed to start collecting data on that for LGBT people. It hasn't happened yet, but all the things that I know about, and we didn't talk too much about kind of the health issues, but it turns out that stigma and discrimination are bad for people's health. So LGBT people came into the epidemic already having higher rates of mental health concerns and physical health concerns. So that result from the kind of exclusion that they face in the world. So I think there's a lot of reasons to think that LGBT people have fared particularly poorly, even in the United States. In other parts of the world, it's been devastating. Organizations have reported that they have to just kind of stop what they're doing and try to provide food and shelter for the people that they are working with. So it's, I think it's likely to have been a setback in a lot of ways for, kind of moving forward on human rights issues. But at the same time, it's really called into heightened relief the economic challenges that people face in the LGBT community, the lack of access to jobs, the kind of need for social services and safe spaces that are being closed down because of the pandemic. So it's a very tough time, and it's not going to get better until we're all getting better. So again, we're all kind of in this pandemic together in that way.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lee. So I've got one more question for you before we dive into audience questions. For everybody participating live, would love for you to take the next minute or two to think about what are the key things you would like to ask Lee on this topic? What's most top of mind for you that we can address today? And we'll do our best to get through all of the questions. Lee, my final question to you before we do the audience Q&A is if you could give all of us, right, very specific calls to action at an individual level, right? As like citizens who, want to create a better society, as organizational leaders who also have influence around how so many other people are impacted, whether it's our employees, customers, and so forth. And then also at a national level, right? So if you, what are the things that, countries could be doing better, even if they are already, even if they are, let's say on the more tolerant side already, what more is yet to be done? So if at those levels, you could give us clear, hey, this is what I would recommend if I could. This is what I'd encourage everyone to do at each level.
Yeah.
I think that would be very helpful for us to hear.
Yeah. I think kind of at the most personal level, I feel like what we've been called to do recently on so many issues, whether it's LGBT issues or racism or sexism, is about listening and reaching out and listening to people's experiences. That's kind of the proactive piece of it that I was talking about earlier. And I think that we always want to think that we're doing better, and sometimes we are, and sometimes we're not. So it's important to to kind of understand where we're not. I think that's both a personal kind of challenge as well as an organizational one. I see organizations really grappling with this issue, these issues right now, whether it's with LGBT people or African Americans or women, and I think that there's a need to kind of revisit what we've been doing and figure out what's worked well and what hasn't. I mean, some of the research suggests that, take diversity training, for example, which I think is the need to educate ourselves. It just seems so obvious, but it turns out that actually diversity education seems to only really matter, seems to only work when it's done in a context of other efforts to make sure our workplaces are inclusive. For example, having somebody whose job it is to actually make sure that these things happen is a really big predictor of both progress for companies and the ability to use the potential advantages of having a diverse workforce, as well as using these other kinds of tools to actually make changes in the workplace. So we've got to make investments in that infrastructure to make that happen. And at the national level, getting policies in place is very important. I think, though, that as somebody who has studied the impact of policies for a long, long time now, related to race and gender, as well as sexual orientation and gender identity, I mean, it's clear that policies are a part of what we need to do, but we have to, but it's not enough. It's not been enough. And whether that's because we're not doing a good job of enforcing those policies or not, it's sort of hard to know. But there are, our policies are designed to require people to kind of be, to take they're very individualistic. If you think you face discrimination, you can go file a charge, but then you're kind of, you have to drive that process. I think figuring out ways that we can be socially more proactive would be great. And then the second thing I would just say is, and this is a big deal for LGBT people, which is you got to collect the data, because you don't know if there's a problem. You don't know if those policies are working unless you can see how people are actually living. How do their wages look? What are their, are they employed or unemployed? Are they living above or below the poverty line? There's just some kind of basic things that are actually pretty hard to track for LGBT people all over the world. We do a little better here in the US, but there's still a lot more we need to do.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lee. So I'm going to dive in here into the audience Q&A, and I'll take them in turn. The first question is from Scott Knox, who says, as the founder of Pride in Advertising and Marketing, Pride AM, I'm keen to ask if you have an economic view on the value of representation of our community in media, even in advertising specifically.
Representation is, I think, a great idea. I think that it can actually have impacts kind of beyond beyond kind of attracting the LGBT market to fulfilling kind of an educational role, showing that LGBT people are part of our larger communities and that they need they're human beings like everybody else, and they need this access to all the same things that everybody else has access to. That's really important. And it is pretty cool. I mean, I still get like a little chill. I was playing a game on my phone the other day, and some ad popped up, and it took me a second to realize, but it was like two men dancing together. And it was charming. I never pay any attention to those ads, but just that one kind of caught my attention. But I think that it's part of the normalization. It's part of the it's part of making LGBT people more fully included in lots of different kinds of ways. So it's not something that I personally have studied. I think it's but I do know that it's something that that seems to have made a difference in terms of people feeling like they are more fully included in the marketplace, for example.
Thank you, Lee. Next question from an anonymous attendee is as follows. Do you worry at all about the risk of aggressive anti-discrimination policies creating fear of employing LGBT employees or resentment to them in the short term? I'm thinking of the attitude some men have about the new policies after Me Too.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think, it might be mitigated to some extent because we're talking about a relatively small group of people, maybe 5%, 6% of the workforce by the most generous estimates. And the chances that people are not going to come into contact with LGBT people in small businesses, for example, are pretty low. But I think that the larger, I think that the larger project of changing policies and explaining to people, why certain kinds of things that you've said to women for decades are no longer acceptable. I mean, I think that has kind of generated some concerns and some backlash. But it's, in my view, it's part of the process. It's part of the cycle. I mean, I grew up in the South, and in the South, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, and other laws were changing, then there was a process of getting past people's discomfort with desegregation, for example, and that's inevitably, I think, part of change. Politically, we were worried in the LGBT community about backlash related to marriage, that maybe we were pushing too hard on that. But guess what? We went from 35% of Americans believing that same-sex marriage was a good idea in 2000 to, I think yesterday I read a poll that said 71% now think that that's a good idea, that that's an acceptable idea. So I think, if we're feeling discomfort about these things and using that as a reason to pull back, then I think we're misjudging kind of the potential for change. We're misjudging our abilities to change as people and as organizations.
Excellent. Thank you, Lee. Next one is from Peggy Olin, who asks, how do you make your employees feel safe to open up and share? Back to your story about the Peruvian embassy, where they had no idea about any of their employees.
Yeah, I think in some cases it's challenging, especially in certain kinds of cultures, certain places where it's still highly stigmatized to be LGBT. So I don't think you want to, kind of pull people out of the closet, but I think having policies, having discussions in the workplace that make it clear that there is an openness to people saying that they are LGBT. I think that those are it's probably, in my view, I'll just say, it's one of the best measures of just how inclusive things are. Not everybody wants to come out. And I think it's important to give people, to let people make those decisions for themselves. But it's, it's all part of the same thing, all the stuff that we've been talking about. I don't think there's like any one action to take that will make it clear to people suddenly, that it's okay for them to be out. But leaders of organizations making strong statements of support, for example, support for pro-LGBT kinds of policy initiatives or against anti-LGBT policy initiatives, will bring people out. Because we've seen that in organizations all across America. When people suddenly realize they are fully included, or it feels like they are fully included, they will start to come out.
Thank you so much, Lee. Next question from an anonymous attendee is, what measures do you hope to see in companies what measures do you hope to see companies take to protect trans employees who transition during their employment?
Yeah, there are actually some good guidelines about that now. I think that they deal with this both sensitively, but also kind of, again, sort of more proactively. And I think the key issue is working together for the trans employee who's making a transition to be working together with human resources, with their supervisors, to kind of make that transition, to let people know, to clarify, that it's not okay to use the what trans people call their dead names, the name that they used to use. It's important to shift pronouns, and those kinds of things can matter. Interestingly, I've heard from people in companies that often they have a hard time in their human resources systems kind of making those sorts of changes, especially now that that we're seeing the rise of non-binary identities. So people who are kind of getting out of the male-female boxes may want to use different kinds of pronouns. So how do you deal with that? Again, so I've been studying IBM, so I'll just give you another example that they actually have. I forget exactly what, the blue pages or something like that. Their global list of employees now has the ability to actually put your pronouns in there. So that's a way to let people know, so they don't have to ask you. You don't have to tell them. You'll just know that. And interestingly enough, they said it also is helpful for a global company where people might not know if a Chinese name refers to a man or a woman. So it has lots of kind of spillover effects that are positive from their perspective. So there are ways to kind of to be proactive and to be sensitive and to make that possible for people.
Thank you so much, Lee. As we get near the end of our time together, I want to ask you, what are just specific ways in which our community can best support you and your endeavors? You've been super generous with your insights today and calls to action. How can we best support you? And if at the end of that, you could share with us a final word of wisdom or call to action, that'd be great too.
Yeah, I would say, it's interesting to think about. I think, as we've been talking about, but I'll just kind of say it again, I think that it's possible for companies, for leaders of companies to be proactive on LGBT issues and LGBT inclusion all over the world, kind of using that power, that I think, that economic power that that you have in that way, and that can be sort of thinking in a much more detailed level. That can even be kind of encouraging and helping to do the experimentation of how to ask questions about sexual orientation and gender identity for your employees, that we'll learn from. I think again, sort of at that very broad level, being involved financially in these efforts globally can make a big difference. Closer to home, I will say, that the Center for Employment Equity at UMass Amherst, that I'm one of the co-directors of, we are forming partnerships with companies to try to learn from what companies are doing to help other companies, other employers do those things as well, to kind of know how to stay out there on that cutting edge. So we started a series that we call What Works, where we look at what companies are doing and how they got there, because that's sometimes the piece that's not so obvious. And I think these kinds of partnerships also make it possible for us to say, here's what we know about what works, and let's have a conversation about that. So we've also done some work in the past with the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission in holding meetings where researchers and the policymakers are kind of sitting down and sharing ideas about what works. So I think these kinds of partnerships are really important for moving us forward. And if anybody's interested in doing that, I'd be very happy to talk to you about that.
Excellently. I want to thank you so much. We shared all the links that you mentioned, all the resources. If there's any others, we'll be sure to include them in the message that goes out with this recording. I'm incredibly grateful on behalf of everybody here for all the thoughts you shared and for the positive direction that you've been pushing everybody in. So thank you so much, and hope to see you again very soon.
Great. Thank you so much. This has been great. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. See you all again soon. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.